Normally when we talk about the guitars in Stairway to Heaven, people are going to jump straight to either the guitar solo or the intro. Funny enough, in terms of tabbing, these are the two easiest parts in the entire song to figure out. They're right up front, they're in your face, clear as day, and working out the notes only really takes about an hour and maybe a couple of playthroughs, maybe a whole day project for someone who's less experienced at tabbing. In terms of tabbing out the guitars for Stairway, the biggest challenge is the rhythm section, especially for 12-string guitars. They sit in the background underneath the vocals, underneath the guitar solo, and the strings are interlaced with octaves that form difficult layers to deconstruct. And of course, lastly, they're playing chords, which are the hardest things to figure out by ear. Identifying the notes can be hard enough if they're buried in the mix. Now, working out a chord with 4 notes is 10 times harder. On a 12-string, where the notes are doubled as octaves, and some of them are doubled in unison, let's just say it gets exponentially more difficult. We're gonna try anyway, so let's hit it from the top. This is the main 12-string riff. So this very first chord is well known. It is A minor 7, add 14. After that sequence, you drop the high G, so you're just playing in A minor 7. And the next chord is, it can be somewhat disputed. I play a D sus2 that resolves into a D major. Now, I've seen other scenarios where that chord is actually played as a D sus4. So as in. So this actually sparked me to listen much closer to the song, and this is my conclusion. The D sus4 probably comes from the live version of Stairway to Heaven, where Page definitely uses it interchangeably with a D sus2. As far as tabbing out the studio version goes, the live version of the song can't be taken seriously as a source, since Jimmy Page is famously known for not playing Stairway live anyway close to how it was originally recorded. So this is most likely one of the causes of tabbing inconsistencies from the intro to the rhythms, the solo, and onward. The way I worked out my tab was not to hone in on the 12-string guitar part, which is panned onto the right channel and pretty tough to break down, but actually to focus on the acoustic guitar on the left channel, which is doubling the exact part, and that has less interference from these paired octave strings. So the left channel is much cleaner, and when I focused on that part, I did hear that indeed he plays a D sus2, and I think a lot of official tabs publish it as a D sus2, so this is definitely the much less controversial chord. The next chord of interest is the one that comes right before the repeat. So it's the transition before we go back to A minor 7. I've seen a few different chords placed here, from D sus4 to all open strings, and the part I'm referring to is this. So that chord right there. Played as open strings, it would sound like this. So the open string chord, I hate to admit, was actually the way I originally learned the song when I was younger, and it really makes no sense. It's chromatic. It would be pretty obvious if Page was playing this chord, but there's no dissonance when you actually listen to the track. So clearly, whatever he's doing is more modally appropriate to the key of the song. D sus4 makes sense because it's a continuation of the previous chord in the same measure. You know, you're just going from D. Plus the G on top works great like a pedal point to transition you back into an A minor 7. The problem is, when I listen to this part, the chord Page plays doesn't sound like another D, which would be the same chord and very consistent. To me, the chord sounds noticeably different. This is where I actually think there's some room for compromise between the two inconsistencies. I think the G on top as the pedal point is definitely there. Now going back to the open chord, when you play 3 open strings on top, the closest chord representation of that is G major 6. So you have the G major, and then an open E. So if you add the pedal point as the G instead of playing that open E, what do you get? A regular G major chord. This is what I believe to be the transitional chord. From a fretboard standpoint, it makes sense to use because it's the perfect chord to buy time for your fingers to shift from the D shape back to the A minor 7 shape. So you get a release of all fingers except for the G, and that puts you in position to shift in the A minor without delay. So now the rest is straightforward. It's very well established. On the repeat, you basically start with the same A minor 7 chord, and then this ending. So it's going to be the top 3 strings of an E minor, D major, C major, D major, which I like to play with up strums. So from the top, one more time. So with that, let's jump into the tab and take a listen so you get a chance to actually see the notes and play along. So notice all these dead notes that are being struck between the chords. At the beginning section of the song, they're not very noticeable, but as the song progresses through the verses, Paige actually plays them harder and harder, and then they become more and more obvious. But they're always there, even though they may be subtle at the very beginning of the song. So this next part, I don't really need to go into detail. In fact, I'm not even going to grab my guitar. I can really just talk you through this section. The only thing that I have to admit, and I really hate to admit this, is when I initially learned this part, I did not learn the rhythm as an 8th note on the and of 4 followed by this slick hammer-on beat 1. I actually just played it as like the second time coming around. So instead of, you know, how it normally should sound, I would have just played it like this. And that's really the downfall of, you know, text file tabs as opposed to something like Guitar Pro, where it's really easy to segment the rhythms out. On a text file, it's much more difficult to convey rhythms and, you know, whether you should be playing an 8th note or a 16th note, which is why I do think as far as a record keeping perspective goes, when it comes to tabbing, electronic tabs like Guitar Pro, definitely superior to a text file, which is much harder to interpret. Anyway, this is mostly just for you to enjoy listening. This part is so simple, it's so straightforward, and there's really no room for mistakes, except on occasion I do see tabs where the part is written out instead of playing through the open chord like this. I hear the part written as this. So in fact, this would sound like this. So that comes from just the fact that someone who's tabbing the song out might not be familiar with the reality that they're listening to a 12-string guitar. On the 12-string guitar, the octave of this note, of this C3, is a C4, which is the same note as this C4 up here on the top. So when you hear a note being played down here, and then you hear the same note being played up here, someone who's more of an amateur might actually confuse those notes and bring everything an octave down and think that it's 2 C3s that are being played, when in fact you're going from C4 to C4 because of the nature of the 12-string guitar. And just so I don't mess up this tab forever, let me go ahead and fix this. So let's listen to one more time just to make sure we got everything right. So that's basically the rhythm for the first 4 verses. It's really repetitive, and the parts actually don't change in terms of the notes, but there is one subtle change going on between section to section. So one of the most striking things about Stairway to Heaven is that the song is gradually speeding up over time. The intro is played at about a tempo of 72 BPM. It's slightly slower than that, but Guitar Pro doesn't let you use half tempos, so 72 is the closest representation. And when we get to the end of the intro, you get a subtle jump to 76 at the start of this 12-string section. From here, the song gradually increases in pace up until when Bonham comes in with the drums. And let's see, here on the tempo marker, suddenly the song kicks up to 85 BPM, and it stays constant until the bridge and so on. So I'm trying to make the tabs simulate this speed up by gradually bumping the tempo as we go from section to section. I found the most accurate way to do this, as I was counting along with the song, is that it kind of increases in 2 BPM increments from one section to another. So when we have this 12-string intro, you're at 76, and when you go into the verse, there's a feeling I get, it goes up to 78. And then on the section back to the chords, I like to play it at 80. And then from here, I actually keep it pretty constant. I found it to not increase much, but when we get into the section right before the drums, I felt that the tempo increased again by another 2 BPM to 82. And then finally, when it gets to Bonham's part, it kicks into high gear. One of the great mysteries is how they timed this out when they were recording. I don't know if they just did it completely free form, or they planned it via metronome and they just sped each section up as they got to it and had someone working a metronome so they could match the time. Or maybe they just did multiple takes and then they composited them together with Studio Magic. Or maybe there's even some production techniques where the tempo is continuously increased by doing something like speeding up the tape or accelerating it, which would be really cool. But once the drums come in, the tempo is really consistent. John Bonham, of course, the human metronome. It stays pretty much solid at 85 until we get to the bridge. Let's get to the main course of this investigation, the bridge. This is, in my opinion, the single most interesting section of the song. Let me play it for you. Let's look at the big picture. You'll notice a couple of things straight off the bat. First, there is a significant tempo change from 85 to 94. The pace jumps more than anywhere else in the song. You also notice a lot of weird meter changes. These are personal decisions that I wanted to make in order to get the tab to look cleaner, in my opinion. This is my favorite thing about the section, but I actually don't want to break that part down right now because I'm going to cover this section again when I talk about the drums, and it really makes more sense to save that discussion for that time because it really reveals a lot about the freeform nature of the bridge when we look at it from a rhythm section point of view. So let's instead focus on the riff itself. So this bridge is really all about the D sus2, D major, and D sus4. More importantly, you want to focus on the up strums. You want to start on an up strum. Up, up, up. To get that proper timbre on a 12-string guitar. If you play it the other way on a down strum, it really doesn't work. It doesn't have that same brightness, that same energy you get. So after the D sus section, we throw in a pretty nifty chord. So this is a C, add 9, add 11. So on the top, it looks kind of like a D chord, but on the bottom, it looks like a C chord, right? So what I do to play this section is I finger the C add 9 chord, but at the beginning, I just play the bottom 3 strings of the C major. And then when I want to get to that add 9, add 11 part, I take my index finger off the major third, and I shift it up to the top, and I play with upstrums. And then you get this nice little staccato before you get back to the D. And it's nice because you have your ring finger on the D as this pedal point the whole time through. So on the repeat, the C add 9, add 11 part, it shifts a little bit. In fact, the measure is actually extended to include an additional 8th note, which again, nifty in the tab. I'll explain this when I get to the drums in another video. The way that it's played is a little bit more intricate, and again, this is one of those things that doesn't convey really well on a text file tab. So the visual of having a Guitar Pro tab makes this section really nice. And then after that, we get to my favorite part about this tab. You have this G chord that leads right into the solo, but there's actually a melody nested within this G chord, and that melody sounds like this. So it's B, A, G, D, F sharp, D, B, A, G. And for some reason, this melody is not always tabbed out. It's rarely. I've seen it tabbed sometimes as an additional lead guitar part, but never as part of the chord progression itself. But it's completely playable as the chord progression. I'm pretty sure that's how it's been recorded. So in my tab, I have it played exactly as part of this G chord. But you can't just play it with open chords. So for example, I can't just do the melody like this. All the other notes are gonna meld together and make it really messy. So you have to use a clever combination of string muting and pick positioning to make sure you're only striking 2 notes at the same time. And this is how you get the complete chord progression from Stairway to Heaven. So the way I do that is I like to play the C, add 9, with my middle finger on the C. And then I slide a fret down, so I'm holding that. It's the third of the G chord with that same middle finger. And then I'm playing the melody with my ring and my pinky. A lot of people don't really like using their ring and pinky, but I find the way that the hand works, these are better at bending and manipulating to getting those notes, because it's actually not really easy. If you're using your index finger instead and your middle and your ring, it's pretty kind of awkward to get that middle finger up there. So I like to do it with the middle finger on the third of the G and to play everything with my pinky and my ring. So let me play the whole section once again, and then we can look back at the tab once again so that you can follow along. To go back and talk about this tab as a whole again, when it comes to accuracy of this 12-string guitar part, this is probably the biggest difference between my tabs and the other ones that are out there. The earlier sections of the song are pretty well established. There are plenty of tabs that teach you how to play that correctly, but this section in particular, a lot of tabs don't have the rhythm right just because it's hard to nail down. They also usually ignore that melody in the transition to the solo, which I always found strange because it's very obviously there and it's something that people would want to learn how to play, but often don't have the ability to, just because the tab that they're referencing, which might have other parts correct, like the guitar solo or the intro, don't have that section. So you're not really getting the complete picture of how to play Stairway to Heaven. So just for safety's sake, I'm gonna play the tab again so you can really see the rhythms. Honestly, if you're gonna try and read along with this sheet music, it's pretty messy just because of how the rhythms change. It makes more sense for a drummer to look at the drum part the way that I did this. And you're really gonna wanna learn this section by ear. I know, we're so close. You really want to hear that solo. But this video is about chords, not leads. So instead, I am going to just finish and talk about the chords at the very end of the song. If we're going to talk about accuracy, this part is really the least accurately tabbed section of the song by anyone, including myself. Not because it's necessarily difficult. In fact, it's actually really simple. There's only ever 3 chords that are being played. But the problem is this rhythm is buried way down in the mix, with the distortion on the solo on top, the drums going hard. When you get to the verse, Robert Plant's wailing. And a lot of components, especially the rhythm guitar and the bass, are really so deeply buried that it's kind of hard to figure anything out except the names of the chords that are being played. Of all the guitar parts in my entire tab, this is most likely to deviate from what Paige is actually playing because it's just so hard to hear. I really had to take interpretive liberties based on what I feel and what makes sense to me compositionally. I would say every other section is either 100% or 99% accurate. And because I'm taking so many liberties and there's a lot of guesswork in this section, it may only be good as 90% or maybe even lower than that if I'm just making up the wrong chords. Back on the guitar, I'm going to start with the rhythm of the chords because that part I can hear really well. Essentially, to break that rhythm down, you're going to start by playing 2 strings, the first 2 strings of the chord, and then strumming out the rest of the chord. Now, the chords themselves, I can tell you the letter associated with the chord. It's clearly A minor, G major, and F major. But the exact voicings and whether or not there are any, subtle changes, it's pretty hard to nail down. They're definitely not power chords, so if you ever see anything like this, or they just tell you to play this, underneath the solo, that's the part that comes after the solo, then the tab is incorrect. These chords also shouldn't be voiced as bar chords either. And I'll explain why. The first chord is straight up A minor. That I can tell you for sure. It's the G major and the F major that are really tough. But I don't believe that they're just triads because it just really doesn't sound right. That just doesn't sound at all like what I'm hearing. I truly think that the chord progression is actually a bit more complex. The G is the hardest chord to work out, so I'm actually going to skip ahead and go to the F. So on that F, I do think I hear an open E on the top string, making this an F major 7. So that means this can't be played as a bar chord F, try your best to bar out without fretting that first string. It's not possible. So you could potentially play this as just the top 4 strings of an F major 7. On a side note, one of my favorite chords. But I think this chord is actually a little bit thicker than that. So I tab it as a second inversion by adding the 5th. So, it's like the bar, but without the bar. You play it like this. This keeps the heaviness consistent with the first chord, the A minor. You don't want to go into this. It's just too light, so. Has a very consistent quality to it. Now, it's also possible to Jimi Hendrix this if you want by fretting that F with your thumb. I don't think Page was known for this technique, and it's actually really hard to pull off on a 12 string. Now, the G chord is truly the biggest mystery of this entire chord progression. We have a lot of options. You have the full open G. It's always possible. You can have G add 12 by reinforcing the D on the second string. The every rose has its thorn chord. Great song to play on a 12 string, by the way. Now, first things first, I don't hear a G on the top. Because it's the highest note, that makes it the brightest note, and when you're trying to decipher a chord progression, it's usually the notes on the top that are the easiest because they really stick out in the mix. I feel like if he was playing an open G, I would be able to pick that out. At least the contrast between having an open E and then back to an open E on the F. That switch is missing. So I actually believe that this, because of how consistent this sounds, the top two strings are playing the same thing between the A and the G and the F. So A minor ends with a C and E, right? F major 7 ends with a C and E. It's not that big of a stretch to think that the G chord is ending with a C and an E. Making this a G major, add 11, add 13. Like we've seen Page use pedal points all throughout this song, and he's already written in complex chords like, the C add 9, add 11. So it's not out of the world to think that Jimmy Page would want to play a slightly more complex chord progression underneath his guitar solo at the end of the song. And really, from a fretboard standpoint, it actually makes a lot of sense for him to keep the top end consistent. It's actually lazier and more economical than, switching all your fingers from one chord, an A minor, to a G, to an F bar chord. All you have to do is hold the top strings open. I don't know that a lot of people have tabbed this section playing it this way, which, is kind of risky for me because I've taken a huge liberty in assuming that Page has played something that, most other people that have undergone this tabbing exercise have not put on paper. It's one of those cases where if I'm wrong, it still sounds great. I'm willing to stick with this. And on my cover of the song, I actually recorded it like this, even though I can't say with definitive proof that this is how Page plays it. Compositionally, it makes sense in my mind, and I think it really does add a lot to the song. Well, this part is actually pretty easy to explain. You probably don't need to see the tab to play along. Since I've been doing it throughout the entire song for consistency's sake, let's just listen to this. And you know what? Just to prove a point, I'm going to unmute all the sections. Let's play a couple lines with the solo, just so that I can show it's not entirely out of place for him to be playing these complex chords underneath the guitar solo like that. I know you want to hear the whole thing, but I can't give it to you. You'll have to stick around for the next video. And yes, the next videos will be all about the solo. But, as you heard when you listen to that, it works perfectly. There's no clash between the harmonics of, this complex G chord or this F major 7 against what Jimmy Page is playing on the solo. So there's nothing wrong with it. Now, after the solo is where the chords do momentarily get easy again. They're just straight up power chords, right? This part everybody should know. The only liberty, like the only thing that could be right or could be wrong, if we're trying to recreate 100% what Jimmy Page was doing with his fingers on the guitar, is you can play the power chord as 2 strings, you know, the root and the 5th, or you can play it as 3 strings. I always prefer the heaviness of 3 strings, you know, reinforcing that octave. But actually on a 12-string guitar, it can be a little bit too much. You're fretting in total 6 strings. I still like the sound of that. This is how I typically play my power chords, so that's how I tabbed it out. But it is very possible that Jimmy Page plays a standard 2-string power chord. With all the dead notes. So if we look at my tab for this section, I actually add a distorted electric guitar to complement the part. And I'm gonna have to admit this, I can't say for sure that that part is 100% there. I know that the 12-string is playing on a clean tone. It doesn't sound distorted to me. And earlier in the song, the 12 strings are complemented by an acoustic guitar on the left channel. When we get to the ending of Stairway to Heaven, I don't hear that the 12-string guitar is playing by itself on the right channel. So there's something on the left channel. It doesn't really sound distorted to me. It's possible that it is a clean 6-string on the other side, or perhaps like a lightly distorted one with, you know, like a classic jangly natural tube distortion. It's really hard to say, again, because of how this section is mixed. I know that when I recorded my instrumental reproduction, I used a distorted guitar tone. And the reason I did that is because it just sounds so good with the distortion. I like to think that that's what's going on. Also, there's this melody that goes on, right? Now, I don't know, again, if this melody is part of the guitar, of the rhythm section, or if it's actually on its own lead that's playing by itself. I do feel like when I listen to the song, this lead is closer to the middle as opposed to being panned out to the side. For aesthetic purposes in a production, though, I really like hearing a distorted guitar panned out to the left channel and then having that drop out in favor of playing a lead. It really creates good contrast that helps the parts stick out and makes the song a little bit more interesting than just having, you know, hard pan guitars on both sides and slipping a lead right in the middle. It also creates room by pushing that lead to the side so it's not interfering with Robert Plant's vocals. So again, this is another thing with both my reproduction and also this tab that might deviate from how the actual song is played. This could be its separate guitar part, and this guitar might not be distorted, it might be clean. It's just hard to say for sure. All I know is at the end, the result is that it sounds great. So when we get to the end of this verse, right before the outro, there is a slight variation in the ending. Let me play this for you. So the difference is that the F power chord comes in half a beat early. It comes in on the and of 4. And what do we see here? Surprise, we see an F major 7. This is a pretty clear F major 7 when I listen to the song. And hearing this as I tabbed out this section actually strengthened my conviction that the chord underneath the solo is an F major 7. And by confirming that this chord is an F major 7, it then strengthens my conviction that the G chord is this G add 11 add 13. And I'll explain why when we get to the outro. Really annoying Guitar Pro thing. When you highlight a note, it just plays that note. So the outro is the exact same chord progression that's underneath the solo. I'm pretty confident at that. And the sequence with which I tabbed out this ending was I had trouble working out the solo. So I actually did the outro first. And That section, it's a little bit cleaner just because you don't have that strong of a distortion of the guitar solo, which is really loud. You have this much more subtle bended lead ending. So I found this part easier to work out as far as breaking down what these chords are. And to me, it sounds like we have a clear F. And again, that just helps convince me that this G chord is this more complex chord right here. And the rhythm is exactly identical. And why would the rhythm be identical and the chords not identical? I don't know. So that's how I have a little bit of confidence to say that I think that this ending, the way that I've tabbed it out, is somewhat accurate. These are things that are always going to deviate when you're trying to break down chords, just because it's really impossible to separate all the notes out, especially when you have a 12 string. You know, 3 notes become 6 notes, 5 notes become 10 notes, and it makes it really hard to say whether, you know, maybe he's not playing that, maybe he's playing that. It's just impossible to tell. My judgment call from a compositional standpoint is to keep everything consistent, especially if it sounds great. If it happens to be wrong, you know, I don't want to be right. And, well, the rest is pretty straightforward. So the last thing I want to talk about is this ritardando at the end. You know, everybody slows down, the band's working together to decrease the tempo to get this cool dramatic ending, right? And just to see, I put the tempo markers on the drum track because, you know, that's where it makes sense to tab out the rhythms. This outro is at a tempo of 102, I believe. I skipped that part earlier. Let's see where I put those tempo markers. On the 12 string. So we are at 102. The solo is at 98. So we're getting a bump up gradually, and 102 is the fastest that the song gets to. So to get to the end, we have a ritardando, and essentially I had to do this entirely by feeling. You don't get enough beats to actually be able to count out the tempo. So I just had to guess different numbers until I had the same feeling as I listened along to the original track. But I actually found it was pretty surprised to get a consistent ending by just decreasing the BPM by 6 every beat. So we go from 102 to 96, 90, 84, 78, 72. And let's just listen to that once more time. If you play this side by side with the song, it's not going to match up perfectly, of course, because the band is doing this free form as they're recording, and this is kind of, you know, static, robotic recreation of that. So this is going to be more stiff as opposed to what the band is doing, which is going to have more, you know, life to it. But I think it matches up pretty close. So that's it. It's the 12-string rhythm track on Stairway to Heaven, as tabbed by me, except I'm scrolling through the drum track right now. This is the 12-string rhythm guitar track, as tabbed out by me. This is what I believe is the closest representation of what Jimmy Page played when he was recording this song. So if you stuck around at the end, I'm going to close out with a bit of a treat. The next videos are definitely going to cover the guitar solo, and I'm going to do it in 2 parts, actually. First, we'll look at just the tab, and I want to talk about all the intricacies that go into that, as well as some other mistakes that I see in other tabs, and also in the covers people do of the solos. You know, incorrect notes here or there, things, the way that people play things, you know, slightly wrong that don't match how Jimmy Page did it on the solo. After that, I'm going to do a second video with the guitar on, obviously not the 12 string, and I'm going to show you how I play every single note of the song. As I already mentioned, I did do a full instrumental reproduction of Stairway to Heaven for the 50th anniversary, which will be linked below for you to check out. And I made sure that the solo was done in a very single take, which I recorded for video evidence, and that you can also see as well. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest things I've ever done in my life. It's more than just playing the right notes. It's recreating every detail of what Page's fingers were doing on the fretboard as he performed his take on the solo. So I'm really excited to talk about that.